So as we move further into chapter 14, we get into what we call solving rational equations. So this comes from question 2. So the question says, determine the value or values that must be excluded as possible solutions. So notice how we have an equation. We're supposed to solve this equation to determine the value of x that makes it a true statement. But notice how the variable is in the denominator. And one of the things we pick up on is division by 0 is undefined. So the value of x that generates a 0 in the denominator must be excluded. So to solve this problem, basically what we focus on are the denominators. What we're asking ourselves is what can you add to 8 that gives you 0? So if I can figure out a value of x that makes this turn to 0, I must reject it or exclude it. Now again, there's a couple ways of doing this. You can just look at, what can you add to 8 to get 0? That would be its opposite, or negative 8. Or again, since this is a linear equation, you can solve for x by putting a negative 8 on both sides of the equation. So the 8, losing 8 gives you 0, so that cancels out, if you will, gets x by itself. So x would equal negative 8. So negative 8 would have to be excluded. Also, if you look at the next expression, notice how x is also in the denominator there. So if I look at that, x minus 8, if I ask myself, what makes that 0? Well, 8 minus 8 would be 0. So notice how 8 would have to be excluded. Or again, if we want, since this is a linear equation, we could solve for x by adding 8 to both sides of the equation. We could get x by itself because the negative 8 and the positive 8 would actually zero out. That would leave you x equals then 8. Now, if you look at x squared minus 64, if we set that equal to 0, a couple ways of doing this. One way is you could isolate the x squared on one side by adding a 64 to both sides. And you can ask yourself, what could you square and get 64? Well, that would be 8. But also notice that if you square a negative 8 times a negative 8 is also 64. So that means there's actually a negative 8 there as well. So an 8 or negative 8 would actually make this 0. Now, what are the different values, though? Well, we already have a negative 8 and 8 over here, and this is an 8 and negative 8. So really, there's only two values of x that we have to exclude. So the excluded values then are so 8 and negative 8. Now, another way to solve this problem is x squared minus 64 is actually a factorable polynomial. Notice how it's a difference of squares. A difference of squares can be factored into a minus b times a plus b. So what you could do is change this to x minus 8 times x plus 8. And ask yourself what makes it 0. Now remember, in multiplication, if you have two factors multiplied together, a lot of times we'll use a and b to represent that. If you're multiplying a times b, the only way to get 0 is one of these factors must be equal to 0. So either a is equal to 0 or b has to equal 0. So again, a represents a factor and b represents a factor. If either one of those is equal to 0, then if you multiply, you're going to get 0. So it's kind of considered the multiplication property of 0. So let's say x minus 8 is a factor. If I can determine what makes it turn to a 0, I can figure out what x is there. That would be x equals 8. And this is also a factor. So if I said x plus 8 equals 0 and solve that, that's how we get x equals negative 8. So both of those values, 8 or negative 8, would create one of these factors would turn into a 0. If I picked 8, this turns into a 0, and 8 plus 8 is 16. But 0 times 16 would be 0. So that would make the whole thing turn to 0. If you choose a negative 8, notice how this turns into a 0. And negative 8 and a negative 8 would be negative 16. But still, negative 16 times 0 is still going to be 0. So both of these values do create 0 on the left side. So that would make the denominator 0. But we cannot make the denominator 0. So we do have to, again, exclude those values. So there's two ways to solve this x squared minus 64. I could kind of look at it from this direction, or I can actually factor and use some critical thinking skills there, because in factoring, if one of those factors is 0, then the whole thing turns to 0. So if 8 is 0, then this factor turns into 0. If 8 is negative, if x is negative 8, then this turns into 0, which means the whole thing turns into 0. So again, these would make zeros, but the catch is we cannot have the denominator equal to 0, so those are, again, what we call excluded values. They have to be thrown out.